Welcome to part 6 of our video series. This episode we've left Desolation Sound and I'm stuck in Stones Boatyard waiting for some parts and a few repairs to the boat. Life in the boatyard is pretty interesting. Not something I'd recommend for everybody, but I managed to survive for a week. Always something going on, hustle and bustle, boats coming in and boats coming out. I took the time to refinish some teak and do a few odd chores around the boat, like replacing the anchor rod. Eventually the parts arrived, and the guys at Stone managed to hoist my motor up, replace the mounts, and drop it down. When Leslie got back, we headed south. Nanaimo's a crowded harbor and you've got to watch out for other boats, big ships, and of course, seaplanes. We had a beautiful sail down to Dod Narrows, turned the motor on for a little while as we crossed through, and then that was it. The motor was off until we hit Clam Bay. A couple of other boats had been coming out of Stones at the same time, and you know what they say, if it's more than one boat, it's a race. And we tacked back and forth slowly, gaining distance on all the other boats. Clam Bay was fairly crowded when we pulled in, but we found ourselves a spot close to the shore and settled in to relax. So Leslie decided to go out for a row and explore. That pretty much finished up that week, what with all the time in the boatyard, so we'll just move right on into the next week. On our last day in Clam Bay, we headed over to Telegraph Harbour in the dinghy through the boat cut. It was the last day of the Hunter Rendezvous and we knew we'd missed it, but we thought we'd pop in anyway and say hello. Then we spent a little bit of time just sitting in the sun, relaxing, before heading south. After a couple of days in Clam Bay, we decided we were going to head south again. We'd managed to try a few new anchorages this trip and we decided to continue the trend. I'd been wanting to give James Bay on Prevost Island a try, and so we decided since the winds were coming from the south, this would be a perfect time. I tried rolling out the sails a couple of times, but really there wasn't that much wind and it wasn't worth it. We were getting into June now and it was definitely shirt sleeve weather. The Gulf Islands are really beautiful, and it's nice to be out when you don't have to share it with a lot of people. There was only one other boat in Prevost Island when we arrived, so we tucked in a little closer to shore, dropped anchor, and prepared to spend some time. and I still aren't the most confident anchorers in the world, so we'd spend a lot of time discussing things before we finally call it a day, take off our life jackets, and get ready to relax. Prevost Island is a private island. The bits and pieces of it are slowly being donated to the park system. We headed out in the dinghy and did a little exploring along the shorelines, and then headed across the bay to where the campground was. The campground is an old orchard and is quite popular with kayakers. The tide was coming in, so we did what we always do and spent about an hour watching all the little tiny creatures and the water ebbing and flowing. A few more boats joined us the next day. We headed back to shore to play with the sea life. I love these sea cucumbers. They're so gorgeous. We even managed to catch a clam squirting in the water in this video. That afternoon we headed over to the other shore and hiked along the point. We were up high and got to see the water from up above. Just off in the distance, that's Salt Spring Island. The terrain here is such an interesting mix of lush green and dried out burnt moss and grass. There are a lot of trails here. They're not very well marked, but it's an island. It's pretty hard to get lost. We headed back on board and had dinner in the cockpit as the sun faded. Then we played a little skip-bo, enjoyed the sunset, and headed off to bed. The next morning we headed ashore for yet another hike. This time we headed inland. You can see that the terrain is much more green and lush. Alberta, I always find it hard to believe that all this territory has already been logged. Everything seems to grow so fast. Huge trees that we would consider old in Alberta are still considered new growth. We found some remains out in the forest of some of the old settlements, and then we headed back to the boat. Next morning we woke up and headed into Ganges. It was only a couple of nautical miles. We tied up in the dock, had a shower, filled up our water tanks, and charged the batteries. Then we were off again. This time we were heading for Russell Island, another new anchorage that we'd never been to. The waterways were filled with ferries, but there wasn't much wind. we didn't really have to worry about them because we maneuvered around them using the motor. When we pulled into Russell Island, there were only 1 or 2 boats, so we dropped our anchor and headed into shore. Spent some time exploring the underwater life and combing the beaches. I even managed to film a barnacle, something I'd never seen before. As we walked around the island, more and more boats were arriving. We realized that by the time the day was over, it was going to be pretty crowded. Next morning we headed in and went to check out the old Hawaiian settlement that's there. I spotted this garter snake in the grass, decided he would be the star of this video. This island was homesteaded by a Hawaiian family that had come to work on the railroad and decided not to go back. Some of the original buildings are still there, and they're looked after by descendants of the family. We headed off the main path to the far east end of the island to see what we could see. And that was it for the next week. We only had 1 week left, so that's just about it for our trip.